Hello and welcome to another video. Today I'm going to be walking you through the technical skills that you need ahead of joining an internship in investment banking or a full-time position. And later on I'm going to be talking you through one Excel formula that should save you quite a bit of time and even a few headaches. But before that, the first technical category is core financial knowledge, really underpinning a lot of, especially the more valuation and financial analysis heavy work that you would do as an analyst or even an intern. I think that core financial knowledge is split into accounting knowledge and then valuation work. So first we have accounting knowledge, and this really starts with the understanding of the three financial statements: the income statement, cash flow statement, and balance sheet. And the other thing within that, as well as understanding how these are laid out, how it flows from each other, and that should be a part of your basic 400 questions guide starting preparation for any technical interview questions. As well as that, is understanding the whole structure of it, that you usually have these statements and then a series of notes afterwards explaining some of the key items. And after you've done that a few times, you're trying to find some key information, maybe look at one of the components of the cash flow statement or the balance sheet in more detail. Let's say trade debtors, you're trying to find that in more detail. You start to remember that and see where certain things are going to be disclosed later on, which things are not, and you can rely on the summary. So that kind of intuitive understanding of where things are found on the statements is another area that should serve you well. The other specific thing is, if you're working with US companies and non-US companies, you need to know the difference between US GAAP and IFRS. So you don't need to know in detail all the various differences. Depending on what industry you're in, you might start to get familiar with a certain sub-industry and the accounting related to that. But what I would say is worth understanding is specifically the difference between the IFRS 16 change and the ASC 842 change. And they both came into effect on the 1st of January 2019, very much in a similar spirit, all looking at trying to change how operating leases are recorded, making them more of an kind of recorded in the balance sheet rather than off balance sheet, making it more transparent if a company has a lot of obligations, a lot of renting of certain types of assets. The difference is, however, and I'm happy to go into this in more detail, I won't go into too much detail here, but it's important because it impacts EBITDA and therefore your EV to EBITDA multiples that you calculate across companies that you want to be consistent, and you need to make sure are all being calculated in the same way so you can compare apples to apples, is understanding that the US GAAP method, while it does on the balance sheet record a right of use asset and a right of use liability for an operating lease, on the income statement it doesn't really reflect that and instead still has the operating expense, which would feed into your operating expense, your EBITDA kind of line. Whereas on the IFRS side, you also have that kind of balance sheet style recording reflected on the income statement, where you have a depreciation expense and an interest expense recorded. So that's something worth considering, worth remembering, and could potentially lead you to having to adjust certain things when you're comparing US and non-US companies in comparable company analysis. But as I said, leave it in the comments if you want me to cover that in more detail. There's a lot of materials online that kind of break that down and go into it in more detail, because it was quite a major change in 2019. So that's some of the core accounting knowledge, and it can really serve you well, especially when you're in a deal and you're having to work very closely with the financial management to prepare the financials, to prepare the free statement model, to understand the various documents they're providing from the accounting and finance department perspective. The other thing is actually valuation work, and so understanding how to do a discounted cash flow, how to do comparable company analysis or comparable transaction analysis when you're trying to price a company, trying to put a value on it. And I would say maybe this is biased from having been in technology investment banking, but the comparable side of the analysis is usually more useful. Now, you would use a DCF, for example, if you're doing a football field analysis for a pitch, but usually it's the comparable, how much are other companies being bought for, particularly because of the volatility of the M&A and fundraising market, that has the highest, the heaviest weighting. So that's something really to get familiar with. And that valuation skill is, in and of itself, it has its own nuances. It's something that requires a bit of experience. Now, something you'll probably be using quite a lot is Capital IQ. It's a software owned by S&P, offered by S&P, and it really it's useful in creating templates, creating Excel templates where you can use formulas to pull in different financial metrics that you can then quickly, and you probably have to make a few adjustments, but quite efficiently compare the multiples currently being traded by, say, a group of companies in a certain sector, and then feed that into a graphical analysis that you put into a pitch or a software sector update. That's quite a big part of business development or pitching work. So the second category is software, and I'll be walking you through Excel, PowerPoint, and search engines. You might think search engine sounds a bit rogue, but that's actually quite a big part of the job, depending on which tasks you're getting involved with. Within Excel and PowerPoint, the first thing is shortcuts. You don't need to know every shortcut under the sun, but for the things you're using the most, for example, in Excel, maybe it's changing decimal points, maybe it's formatting, which is actually Control-1, or saving a file, F12, saving as. All those kind of different options, they can save you a lot of time if you're doing them hundreds of times a day, and actually they allow you to be more precise in your movements, especially when someone's watching you from behind or you're doing it in a meeting, or even navigating across a sheet, right, using Control, left arrow, up arrow, right arrow, down arrow. Now that should be quite a familiar one, or Control to select certain things at once, or doing the borders of a certain cell range using a shortcut. And one way to access every single kind of option on the home tab, the view tab, the insert tab, whatever you're looking at, is the Alt key. If you click on Alt, you'll have a series of black buttons appear at the top, and that will direct you as to which letter you need to click to access a certain option. And with that, you can learn any configuration of shortcut quite visually without having to look it up. So that's really helpful, and something that you'll have to get used to if you want to save time and really save energy, which should be an absolute priority. The other thing within Excel, as well as shortcuts, is formulas. And the big advantage that analysts nowadays have is ChatGPT, Gemini, those kind of large language models, and their ability to create bespoke formulas, efficient formulas, or even condense the existing formulas you have to make them more user-friendly. Now, the big thing with Excel is, and I remember thinking this, like, why do investment bankers still use Excel? It's extremely frustrating when you have a large Excel file, especially for comparable company analysis, or if you're doing some sector analysis and you have thousands and thousands of rows of data. Excel just is not made for it, and it crashes the computer. It gets you really annoyed because you're already up late, and I've seen people throw their laptop across the room. It's quite frustrating. The reason why they use Excel and they don't move to, say, coding or some kind of other database analysis, maybe SQL, is because it's all about other people being able to log into your Excel file and see what you've done, especially on the financial modeling perspective. You're creating models not to look nice and come up with an output figure, but to show others the workings out, to show others how this machine is expected to run the company you're expecting the company to run in the next few years. And that's why Excel will pretty much stay in the industry for a very long time, as what most people believe, at least. So it's really key that when you're making those formulas, you're ensuring they're clear, they're easy to understand. And that's the other thing, it's not just about shortcuts and formulas, it's the whole architecture. How do you design a document? How do you design a piece of analysis so that it's clear and intuitive to understand? So when you're doing a market research analysis or market sizing analysis, it's not about the final figure, it's about the workings before that. So that's kind of the Excel side of things. Within the formulas themselves, I did mention I'll give you one formula. Index match is very common, and a lot of people have probably heard about it, all kind of about extracting values based on a large table of values, and maybe you have an X variable and a Y variable, and you're creating a formula to kind of match based on certain input cells a certain value in that table. A better formula, and one that I think is more versatile, slightly more modern than compared to the index match formula, is the X lookup. Now, you may have heard it, but if you haven't, I strongly recommend you check it out. It's more intuitive to use, and when you're doing the open brackets, X lookup open brackets, Excel always gives you a guide as to how that formula works, and so that's more intuitive for the X lookup than the index match. That's something I recommend checking out. We then move on to PowerPoint. Now, when we look at PowerPoint, I mentioned the shortcuts, the Alt key to access any option on the home, insert view tab, all of those different ones. The one that's most useful for PowerPoint, I'd say, is Align. And you can learn the Alt configuration to get the Align tool up, but I would literally move that into your quick access toolbar so that Alt 1 is Align, and then you can go Alt 1L and you can align. Say if you've got 3 boxes selected and they're across the page, you can align them to the left of the page, and really make sure that it's accurate and it's pleasing to the eye. And that's another thing with PowerPoint. In the same way Excel is about architecture of a piece of financial analysis, PowerPoint is very much about the design element. How do you present information? Yet, multiple things. You're not always being spoon-fed information by an MD as to how they want slides to look at. You're usually having to go and create an investor deck, understand the company's story yourself, understand the equity story, use consulting reports to bolster that, use all of the company's materials, which may not be as concisely articulated because they're across a variety of different documents, and put that into a Word document story of where this company is at, what's the catalyst for its future growth, what the management are like, what their financial position is like, and weaving that into a narrative that you then put onto PowerPoint. But then the key thing is not just kind of creating a certain design on PowerPoint, it's knowing how to present information. What kind of templates do we use? How do we present this so that it's captivating? How do we orient things going from one side of the page to the other side of the page? How do we emphasize certain statistics? It's a whole art form, and that's why I think that people who study graphic design at university are probably very well positioned to do a lot of the PowerPoint work in investment banking, because a lot of people who invest in banking, they don't have that experience. They're more numerical in terms of how they think, and you get people who overlap between the numerical and the creative side, but it can be difficult to completely delve into that more graphics design styled type of work. So you have Excel, PowerPoint, and the final software related skill I'd say is search engines. And this is really tough because most of us know how to use search engines. I mean, there are some specific things like using speech marks so you have a certain letter, using the word PDF so you know PDFs are coming up. But I think it's the persistence and just the adaptability that when you're trying to find a piece of information that is really hard to find and lodged well deep into the web, having the persistence and the knowledge to find that is a very valuable skill in investment banking. Whether it's for a pitch, whether it's for that equity story that I mentioned that you're going to use to make the investor presentation, you need to be able to find unique information online and source it. And you need to know how to also identify what's a reliable piece of information and what's not. Press releases, so news items officially talking about a company's updates, is very reliable. Websites that are just summarizing or potentially forecasting company financials or estimating what private company financials are completely irrelevant. They're not helpful. So you need to start to have discernment what's reliable and what's not reliable. I'll give you an example of why I think search engine or research, basically internet research, is a difficult skill and one that needs to be mastered. And maybe it's one again that's kind of refined through experience, is when I was in the role and we were looking for potential accounting software targets based in Italy. Now, we started researching, we just couldn't find any because every single Italian accounting software company had been acquired already. They weren't relevant targets. And so we had to go, we're using CapIQ, we're using press releases, we're using websites, trying to find accounting companies that didn't specifically said they were not yet acquired or they weren't part of a bigger company. And it took hours and hours of research. Things, they're not easy. Now, with the advancements of ChatGPT and various other softwares online in that kind of Gen AI space, you probably have a bit of help in finding some of those ravines of information where it's quite difficult to find the answer initially, but still it requires persistence. And then again, discernment as to what's reliable and what's not reliable, and sourcing that information, because that's another thing, you might write it down wrong, especially when there's a lot of different sources. So we've talked about core financial knowledge and software. The final thing is more advanced application of those two things, of the softwares and of the core financial knowledge, or the various skills you need in any task in investment banking. I think that is kind of really encapsulated in financial modeling. Creating a financial model, a free statement model that you can then present to investors for a company. That requires a whole host of accounting knowledge, but accounting knowledge isn't enough. It also requires Excel skills, formulas, the shortcuts, but again, that's not enough. And that's where you really need to, one, use templates, other created reports or models so you can see how they've been done, but also intelligently thinking about the model so that it's structured in a logical way, it's structured in a way that anyone can pick it up and they intuitively understand it. That's really tough, and I think it takes a lot of experience. And the other thing is very prone to error. You need to be able to know how to put checks in that model, how to check through your own model to make sure you can resolve, say, the balance sheet not balancing, or resolve issues that you can't even detect with a checker formula. So that's kind of a tough skill. It's one that's refined through experience, refined through being on deals and working through different models, and sometimes even being told off by the MD because you're doing it wrong, and then you thoroughly learn how to do it properly. But it is more of a baptism of fire. It's a really tough skill encapsulating a lot of different items. And it's not just the traditional financial model, it might also be things like funds flow analysis. So once I was on a fundraising deal, and there's a whole load of analysis in terms of where do the funds actually flow. If a company is raising, I don't know, $50 million, which investors get what, how much goes to that company, what if some investors are selling their stake as well as the company fundraising. You have to understand all the different agreements that have been agreed between the investors and the lawyers when those initial investors put their money into the company in the first round, or maybe if there's been several rounds, how those different investors rank against each other, whether they're pari passu, whether they're the same ranking, or some have seniority over others, especially if there's been an equity round where the company was in trouble and investors have put in more money. You have to start modeling how all that hierarchy interacts with each other and what that means for the funds coming in. Also, how does the investment bank get paid? Where does that come out? What proportion of funds is directed towards that firm? And the legal fees. And there's a whole host of different kind of scenarios you have to model depending on what's finally agreed. So that's another kind of complex piece of analysis. And it really emphasizes the point that it's not just about formulas and shortcuts for Excel. It's about the whole understanding of how the analysis fits together and how to design it in a clear way so that you're not making an error, and so that other people understand it and can trust it. The other thing is, you might think VBA, Python, Tableau, that these more advanced softwares are really important for investment banking, that you should learn to code. Well, I say you absolutely should learn to code, you should be familiar with it, and it's a great thing to put in your CV. But in terms of the hierarchy of skills, it's not too necessary for investment banking, I'd say. In fact, I know people that got told off for using VBA because they were trying to speed up something, but actually it's not a 100% reliable thing, especially when you have a model with thousands and thousands of input rows of data. It's too risky to use a piece of code to try and edit it or save some time. It's much better to do it by hand. So I'd say don't get too worried about the more advanced software. Sometimes using Python is helpful, sometimes VBA can be very helpful, but not always. And actually it's usually the user-friendly formulas that everyone can understand that is more beneficial in the kind of financial modeling setting. So hopefully that insight into some of the technical skills, what's important, and really what is involved on a day-to-day basis and how those skills relate to that, hopefully that's been helpful. If there are any skills you'd want me to look into in more detail, maybe explore in more detail, maybe there's a tutorial, do let me know in the comments and I'll be sure to try and make that as a future video. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.